The end of the world does not always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it arrives with the scratch of a pen or the crackle of a dry leaf catching fire. But before we can understand the ashes that drifted over the Mediterranean, before we can smell the smoke of the burning scrolls, we must first understand the audacity of the fire's fuel. We must go back to the moment when the world decided that it could remember everything. It is 300 years before the birth of Christ. The known world has just been shattered. Alexander the Great, the golden boy of Macedon, has stormed across the earth like a natural disaster, smashing the Persian Empire and dragging the borders of the map all the way to India. And then, just as quickly, he died. He left behind a corpse in a honey-filled coffin and an empire torn apart by his generals, the Diadochi, the successors. These were wolves fighting over a carcass. They carved the world into kingdoms with swords and blood. But in Egypt, one wolf decided he wanted something more than land. Ptolemy Isoter was a soldier, a bodyguard to Alexander, a man intimately familiar with the brutal utility of violence. When he claimed Egypt, the richest prize of them all, he did not just want to rule it, he wanted to own it. He built his capital, Alexandria, on a strip of land between the sea and the marsh, a city designed on a grid, rational, Greek, and terrifyingly modern. It was a city of white marble dazzled by the African sun. But Ptolemy knew that legitimacy did not come from marble. It came from lineage. He needed to prove that he was not just a warlord squatting on the Nile. He was the true heir to Alexander's soul. And Alexander had been a student of Aristotle. Into this court of soldiers and spies walked a man named Demetrius of Phalerum. He was an exile, a former tyrant of Athens who had been overthrown and forced to flee for his life. He was a student of the Peripateic school, a man who believed that the chaotic universe could be tamed if it were catalogued. He arrived in Alexandria with a bruised ego and a dangerous idea. He found Ptolemy not on a battlefield, but in the growing luxury of the royal quarter, the Bruchion. The conversation that likely took place between the warlord and the philosopher is one of the turning points of human history. Demetrius told the king that true power was not the ability to destroy, but the ability to know. If Ptolemy could gather together all the books of all the peoples of the earth, the Greeks, the Jews, the Egyptians, the Persians, the Indians, he would hold the mind of the world in his hand. He proposed a universal library. It would not be a mere collection of private curiosities. It would be a state institution, funded by the royal treasury, dedicated to the systematic acquisition of every thought ever written down. Ptolemy, a man of immense ambition, was seduced. He gave Demetrius the gold, the land, and the mandate. They called it the Mauseon, the Temple of the Muses. It was not a library in the modern sense. It was a cult center, a research institute, a botanical garden, and a zoo. But at its heart were the shelves that needed to be filled. The project began with a hunger that bordered on madness. To collect all the books in the world was an impossible task, but the Ptolemies approached it with the ruthless efficiency of a military campaign. They did not just buy books, they hunted them. Agents were dispatched to the corners of the Mediterranean with bags of gold and authorization to purchase entire libraries. They scoured the book markets of Athens and Rhodes. They bought the obscure, the contradictory, and the heretical. They paid by the weight of the papyrus. But purchase was too slow for the appetite of the king. The acquisition policy soon turned predatory. A decree was issued, known as the Ship's Fund. Any ship that docked in the harbor of Alexandria, the busiest port in the world, was immediately boarded by royal inspectors. They were not looking for contraband wine or weapons. They were looking for scrolls. If any books were found on board, they were confiscated and taken to the library. There, an army of scribes would frantically copy the text. The copy was then given back to the ship's captain. The original was kept by the king. It was state-sponsored intellectual piracy. Imagine the scene in the warehouses of the harbor. A merchant captain, furious and impotent, watching as his precious copy of Euripides or a navigational chart of the Black Sea is carried away by royal guards. He is handed a fresh, ink-smelling copy on cheap Egyptian papyrus in return. He has been robbed, but the world has been enriched. Through this aggressive theft, the library swelled. It absorbed the medical knowledge of Hippocrates, the histories of Herodotus, the geometric proofs of Euclid. It swallowed the wisdom of the past whole. The scale of the operation was industrial. The library eventually employed hundreds of scholars who lived on the grounds at the king's expense. They were given free food, tax exemptions, and, most importantly, servants. These servants were the unsung heroes of the library, the copyists. Often educated slaves, they sat in scriptoriums that smelled of cedar oil, used to preserve the scrolls and stale ink, working until their eyes failed. They produced the standard editions of Homer that we still use today. They invented punctuation, accents, and the very concept of a critical edition. They were turning the chaotic oral traditions of the Bronze Age into the structured data of the Iron Age. The hunger for books led to legendary acts of deceit. One story, perhaps apocryphal but spiritually true, tells of Ptolemy III. He yearned for the official state copies of the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, which were kept in the Athenian archives. These were the master texts, the original files. He asked the Athenians to lend them to him so he could have them copied. The Athenians, wary of the kleptomaniac dynasty in Egypt, demanded an exorbitant deposit, 15 talents of silver, a fortune that could build a fleet of warships. Ptolemy paid it without blinking. He took the scrolls, brought them to Alexandria, had them copied, and then he kept the originals. He sent the copies back to Athens and told them to keep the 15 talents. The Athenians had the money, but Alexandria had the soul of Greek tragedy. This was the ethos of the place. Knowledge was a resource like grain or gold, and it was to be hoarded in the silo of the Mausian. The library became a cage for the muses, a place where the free-floating genius of the Greek spirit was pinned down like a butterfly in a display case. It was magnificent, and it was sterile. The scholars who lived there were often mocked by outsiders. The skeptic Timon of Phlius called them bookish bergkoops, men who argued endlessly in the basket of the muses, fattened like prize geese by the king. They were disconnected from the grit of real life, insulated by the walls of the royal palace. But inside those walls, a revolution was happening. For the first time, a scholar could walk down a colonnade and pull a scroll from a shelf that contained the star charts of a Babylonian priest. He could compare them, side by side, with the observations of a Greek astronomer. He could cross-reference the medical practices of the Nile Valley with the theories of Kos. This density of information created a critical mass. It was here that Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth by measuring shadows. It was here that Herophilus dissected the human eye and discovered the optic nerve. It was here that the Old Testament was first translated from Hebrew into Greek, a Septuagint opening the Jewish scripture to the Gentile world. The physical reality of the library is something we must strain to visualize, for not a single stone remained standing. It was likely a series of colonnaded walkways, peripatos, surrounding a central garden. The books were not bound volumes with spines. They were scrolls rolled up and stored in armaria, wooden pigeonholes. A tag, the syllabos, hung from the end of each roll, identifying the author and title. To find a book, you needed a map. And that map was the Pinax, a monumental catalog written by the librarian Callimachus. It was 120 scrolls long, just a list of books. It classified all knowledge into genres: rhetoric, law, epic, tragedy, comedy, lyric poetry, history, medicine, material science. It was the first time the human mind had been organized into a searchable database. Yet there was a shadow hanging over this temple of reason. It was built on the whim of tyrants. The Ptolemies were not benevolent educators. They were absolute monarchs who married their own sisters and murdered their own children to secure the throne. The library was a vanity project, a display of imperial power. It relied entirely on royal patronage. As long as the king loved books, the library thrived. But if a king preferred war or wine, or if the king was weak, the rot would set in, and the collection itself was fragile. The papyrus is a miraculous material, light and durable in the dry heat of Egypt, but it is organic. It decays. It eats itself. It is food for worms and insects. To maintain a library of 500,000 scrolls required a constant, frantic effort of preservation. Every scroll had to be unrolled, checked for rot, and recopied every few decades. The knowledge of the world was not carved in stone. It was written on dry grass. It was a living organism that needed to be fed with money and labor. By the 1st century BC, the dynasty of the Ptolemies was exhausting itself. The gene pool was stagnant. The treasury was drained by civil wars. The Romans were encroaching from the west, their iron legions casting a long shadow over the Hellenistic east. The library still stood, its shelves groaning with the weight of centuries, but the city around it was becoming dangerous. The mob of Alexandria, a volatile mix of Greeks, Egyptians, and Jews, was becoming a political force. The kings were weak. And in the distance, the sails of a new conqueror were appearing on the horizon. We end this first chapter not with fire, but with the quiet scratching of a quill in a sunlit room. A librarian, perhaps Aristarchus of Samothrace, is hunched over a text of Homer. He makes a mark in the margin, correcting a line, saving a thought from oblivion. He is surrounded by 500,000 ghosts, the voices of the past speaking in unison from the cedar shelves. He believes that this place is eternal. He believes that because the knowledge is gathered, it is safe. He cannot imagine that a day will come when the shelves will be empty, when the marble will be lime, and when the great silence will return. He does not know that he is sitting in a fireplace, waiting for a spark. Time is the enemy of all things, but for the Library of Alexandria, the first true enemy wore a laurel wreath. By the middle of the 1st century BC, the sun was setting on the Ptolemaic dynasty. The bloodline of the pharaohs had thinned into a sordid drama of incest, murder, and incompetence. Ptolemy XII, known as the flute player, had bribed his way onto the throne and left his children a kingdom that was essentially a client state of Rome. When he died, he left his daughter, Cleopatra VII, and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, locked in a civil war that threatened to tear the city apart. Into this cauldron sailed Julius Caesar. It was 48 BC. He was pursuing his rival Pompey the Great, but he arrived too late. Pompey was already dead, murdered by the boy king's advisors on the beach. Caesar, finding himself in the most volatile city on earth with only 4,000 legionaries, decided to stay. He took up residence in the royal palace complex, the Bruttian, the very quarter that housed the museum and the library. He was not there to read. He was there to settle the Egyptian succession and collect the debts owed to Rome. The arrogance of Caesar was absolute. He paraded through the streets with his lictors, symbols of Roman authority, inciting the riotous anger of the Alexandrian mob. The young King Ptolemy XIII and his general, Achillas, saw an opportunity. They mobilized the royal army, 20,000 men, and besieged the Romans inside the palace. The hunter became the prey. Caesar, the master of the open battlefield, was suddenly trapped in a chaotic urban war, fighting street by street, house by house. The strategic nightmare for Caesar was the sea. He needed to maintain communication with Rome and his reinforcements. But the great harbor of Alexandria was filled with the Egyptian royal fleet's 72 warships, triremes and quinqueremes, capable of blockading him into starvation. Caesar looked at the forest of masts bobbing in the water and made a cold calculation. He could not capture the ships. He did not have the men. Therefore, he had to destroy them. It was a decision made with the ruthless pragmatism of a field commander, with zero regard for the cultural collateral damage. he ordered his soldiers to set the fleet on fire. Pitch and torches were thrown onto the decks of the Egyptian galleys. The dry wood, seasoned by the African sun and coated in tar, caught instantly. The fire was spectacular. It leaped from ship to ship, creating a wall of flame that lit up the night sky. But fire is a wild animal. Once released, it does not obey orders. The wind was blowing from the sea toward the land. The flames, fed by the burning rigging and a melting pitch, jumped the gap between the water and the stone wharves. The fire roared into the dockyards. Alexandria was a city of stone, but its lifeblood was trade, and the harbor was lined with warehouses, granaries, and depots filled with timber, papyrus, and grain. These structures turned into blast furnaces. And among these warehouses were the apostichea, the deposits. These were the holding pens for the scrolls. The main library was situated within the palace grounds, but the collection had grown so vast over the centuries that the overflow was stored in buildings near the harbor. Thousands of scrolls, destined for export or recently confiscated from incoming ships, sat in cedar crates, waiting to be catalogued. To the fire, the poetry of Hesiod and the astronomy of Aratus were nothing more than dry fuel. The Roman philosopher Seneca, writing years later and quoting Livy, claims that 40,000 scrolls were destroyed in the blaze. 40,000. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the equivalent of losing every play written by Shakespeare, every dialogue of Plato, and the entire corpus of Aristotelian logic, wiped out in a single afternoon. We must try to visualize this moment not from the perspective of Caesar, who was busy fighting for his life, but from the perspective of the librarians. Aristonicus of Alexandria, a grammarian and contemporary of these events, would have been in the main complex, watching the orange glow consume the skyline. The smell would have been distinct, not just the acrid scent of burning wood, but the sweet, heavy smoke of burning papyrus and the sharp tang of melting ink. The ash that fell on the marble courtyards of the museum was the cremated remains of human thought. The fire did not consume the entire library. The main hall, the Mausoleum itself, likely survived, protected by the stone walls of the palace precinct. But the psychological wound was deep. For 300 years, the scholars of Alexandria had believed that they were building a fortress against oblivion. They believed that by gathering knowledge in one place, they were making it safe. Caesar's fire proved the opposite. By gathering everything in one place, they had made it vulnerable. They had put all of humanity's eggs in one basket, and a Roman general had just kicked it over. The siege of Alexandria dragged on for months. There was fighting in the Delta, fighting on the Pharos lighthouse, fighting in the streets. The water supply was poisoned. The palace was stormed. Through it all, the scholars cowered in the lecture halls, the war raging just outside the colonnades. When Caesar finally triumphed, placing Cleopatra on the throne, the city was scarred. The Queen of the Nile was a woman of high intellect, the first of her dynasty to actually speak Egyptian, and she felt the loss of the books keenly. It is said that years later, her lover Mark Antony, trying to impress her and perhaps atone for Rome's vandalism, raided the rival Library of Pergamum in modern-day Turkey. He stole 200,000 scrolls and shipped them to Alexandria as a gift for Cleopatra. It was a grand gesture, a transfer of knowledge from one conquered city to another. The shelves were refilled. The gaps in the catalog were plastered over with stolen parchment. But the first scorch had changed the atmosphere of the place. The era of the Scholar King was over. The Ptolemies were gone, replaced by Roman prefects who viewed Egypt as a grain farm, not a university. The library was no longer the vanity project of a dynasty. It was a municipal institution in an occupied city. The funding began to dry up. The great thinkers, the Archimedes, the Eratosthenes, ceased to flock to the city. The intellectual energy of the Mediterranean began to drift toward Rome, or later, to Constantinople. The fire of 48 BC was not the end. The library would survive for another 4 centuries. But it was the first premonition of mortality. It demonstrated that the greatest enemy of history is not time, but the indifference of men with swords. As the smoke cleared over the great harbor, leaving the blackened skeletons of the warehouses standing against the blue sky, the librarians must have looked at their surviving scrolls with a new, terrifying realization. We are not the owners of this wisdom. We are merely its temporary custodians. And the lease was running out. Centuries dissolved. The Roman Empire swallowed the Mediterranean whole. The Ptolemies became a memory. Their statues toppled or repurposed. Alexandria remained the second city of the empire, the granary of Rome, but its soul was shifting. The mother library in the royal quarter, the Bruchion, had not vanished overnight, but it had suffered the slow, humiliating death of bureaucracy. Neglect is a fire that burns without a flame. Roman emperors, while occasionally visiting, were more interested in the grain shipments than the grammarians. The stipend for the scholars dwindled. The roof leaked. The papyrus rotted. By the 4th century AD, the intellectual center of gravity had moved. It left the royal palaces and migrated south to the poorest, most populous, and most dangerous quarter of the city, Rhakotis. Here stood the Serapeum. The Serapeum was not just a library. It was a fortress of the old gods. Built on a high, artificial hill, accessed by a staircase of 100 steps, it loomed over the city like a thunderhead. It was the temple of Serapis, the hybrid god created by the first Ptolemy to unite the Greeks and Egyptians, a deity with the face of Zeus and the soul of Osiris. The temple was a masterpiece of architecture, plated in gold and silver, its halls lined with marble. And in its colonnades, protected by the sanctity of the god, lay the daughter library. This was the surviving remnant of the great collection. It held perhaps 40,000 scrolls, the backups, the duplicates, and the survivors of the Bruchion. But the atmosphere here was different. The mother library had been an ivory tower for the court elite. The Serapeum was a public library, open to the citizens. Yet, citizen was a loaded word in 4th century Alexandria. The city had become a pressure cooker of sectarian violence. The clean, rational grid of the Ptolemies was now a maze of warring neighborhoods. The Greek intellectual elite men like Theon, the mathematician and father of Hypatia, still walked the halls of the Serapeum, teaching Neoplatonism and astronomy. They viewed themselves as the guardians of a light that was flickering out. They spoke the pure Attic Greek of the classics. They read Plato and Plotinus. They looked at the stars and saw geometry. But outside the walls of the Serapeum, the streets belonged to a new power. Christianity had risen from a persecuted sect to the state religion of the empire. The Bishop of Alexandria was no longer a hiding fugitive. He was a political warlord, often more powerful than the Roman prefect. The Christian population of the city was not interested in the geometry of the stars. They were interested in the salvation of the soul. To the illiterate dockworker or the linen weaver living in the shadow of the temple, the Serapeum was not a university. It was a house of demons. The conflict was not just religious. It was class warfare disguised as theology. The philosophers in the Serapeum represented the old money, the old aristocracy, the Greek-speaking elite who had ruled Egypt for 600 years. They looked down on the unwashed multitude. They believed that truth was complex, accessible only to the initiated few who could read the dense, unpunctuated scrolls of the ancients. The Christians, conversely, preached a radical equality. They claimed that the truth was simple, written in a book that anyone could understand, or at least hear preached. They viewed the intricate astronomical devices and the dissected animals of the scientists not as research, but as sorcery. Why measure the earth when it is destined to burn? Why study the body when the flesh is sinful? The tension was palpable. Theon and his daughter Hypatia moved through the city like ghosts of a bygone era. Hypatia, a woman of brilliance who taught philosophy to both pagans and Christians, tried to bridge the gap. She represented the last hope of the Hellenistic spirit, cool, rational, and tolerant. But tolerance is a luxury of peacetime. By the late 4th century, the Roman Empire was cracking. The Emperor Theodosius I, ruling from distant Constantinople, was a devout Christian determined to unify the empire under the Nicene Creed. He issued edicts closing pagan temples, banning sacrifices, and extinguishing the eternal fires. In Alexandria, these edicts were the sparks that fell into the dry tinder of the city. The Serapeum stood as a defiant anomaly. The chanting of the priests of Serapis could still be heard over the rooftops. The smoke of incense still drifted down into the Christian quarters. It was a visual and auditory insult to the new order. The Bishop of Alexandria, a man named Theophilus, looked up at the great temple on the hill and saw a rival citadel. He saw a cancer that had to be cut out. The scholars inside the library continued to copy their texts, to calculate the movement of the planets, to argue about the nature of the soul, but they were no longer studying in a vacuum. They were studying in a bunker. They must have felt the eyes of the city upon them. They must have known that the walls of the Serapeum were thick, but they were not thick enough to stop history. The ivory tower was surrounded, and in the year 391, the tension that had been simmering in the alleyways of Alexandria finally boiled over. The man holding the match was Theophilus, the patriarch of Alexandria. History has remembered him as a saint, but to his contemporaries, he was known as the Pharaoh of the Church. He was a man of boundless energy and terrifying ambition, a builder of churches and a destroyer of temples. He did not believe in coexistence. He believed that the mere presence of pagan idols in a Christian city was a spiritual contamination that required sterilization. The spark was lit when Theophilus received permission from the emperor to convert an old, abandoned temple of Dionysus into a church. During the renovations, the workmen discovered hidden subterranean caverns filled with cult objects, ritual skulls, phallic symbols, and statues of the old gods. A more diplomatic man might have destroyed them quietly. Theophilus put them on parade. He organized a mocking procession through the agora, holding the sacred artifacts up to the ridicule of the crowd. For the pagan population of Alexandria, the professors, the students of the museum, the wealthy merchants who still poured libations to Serapis, this was the final indignity. They had endured the closing of their smaller shrines. They had endured the loss of state funding. But to see their mysteries dragged through the mud and jeered at by the mob was a declaration of war. The reaction was spontaneous and violent. The pagan community, usually divided by philosophical squabbles, united in fury. They armed themselves. Swords were pulled from beneath scholars' robes. A riot erupted in the streets, a vicious, confused melee where theology was debated with axes and stones. Christians were killed. The pagans, realizing they were vastly outnumbered by the patriarch's followers, executed a tactical retreat. They fell back to the only defensible high ground left to them, the Serapeum. The great temple complex on the hill was transformed instantly from a university into a citadel. The massive bronze doors were slammed shut and barred. The scholars and philosophers, who had spent their lives debating the nature of the good, now found themselves manning the ramparts. They took hostages, Christians captured during the street fighting, and dragged them inside the sacred precinct. The Library of Alexandria had become a bunker. Inside the fortress, the mood was apocalyptic. The leader of the resistance was a man named Olympius, a philosopher who practiced a mystical, ritualistic form of Neoplatonism. As the roar of the Christian mob surged against the outer walls like a rising tide, Olympius walked among the terrified defenders. He was trying to solve a theological crisis. The defenders were looking at the colossal statues of Serapis and the other gods, waiting for them to come to life and smite the attackers. Nothing was happening. The gods were silent. Olympius rallied them with a strange, haunting argument. He told them that the statues were merely matterwood, stone, and bronze. They were breakable. But he argued, the powers that had inhabited them, the divine spirits of wisdom and order, had already flown up to heaven. They were fighting for the empty shell of their religion, but it was a shell that contained the memory of the world. The siege of the Serapeum was a strange, suspended moment in history. Down below, the city was in lockdown. The Roman prefect, Evagrius, was powerless to stop the violence. The army stood by, unsure which side to take. Theophilus commanded the streets, demanding the destruction of the fortress. Up above, inside the colonnades, the defenders slept among the scrolls. The smell of fear mixed with the smell of old papyrus. They were trapped. They knew that there was no relief column coming. The emperor in Constantinople, Theodosius I, was a pious Christian who had already declared war on paganism. They were waiting for a verdict from the capital. A letter had been sent to the emperor, explaining the situation and asking for orders. For weeks, the standoff continued. The daughter library was held hostage by the very men who cherished it, protected by a wall of desperate philosophers who were ready to die rather than see their world desacralized. It was the ultimate collision of the two forces that defined the late antique world: the fading, intricate, elitist light of classical paganism and the rising, populist, uncompromising fire of the new faith. As the sun set each evening over the Mediterranean, casting the long shadow of the Serapeum over the restless city, the defenders must have wondered if this was how it ended, not with a debate, but with a slaughter. They sat in the dark, surrounded by the wisdom of 700 years, waiting for the messenger who would carry their death sentence. The siege of the Serapeum was a war of nerves, and by the summer of 391, the nerves were fraying. The great bronze doors, which had stood open to the curious for centuries, were now barred with heavy timbers. Inside, the air was stagnant, recycled by the lungs of hundreds of desperate men. These were not soldiers by trade. They were grammarians, rhetoricians, and poets. They were men whose hands were stained with ink, now gripping sword hilts that felt alien and heavy. They had turned the sanctuary of wisdom into a fortress, but as the days turned into weeks, the fortress began to feel like a tomb. The silence of the library at night was different now. In the old days, the silence had been a companion to study, a respectful hush that allowed the mind to travel. Now, it was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Every creak of the cedarwood shelves, every rustle of a mouse in the papyrus, sounded like the footsteps of the mob. The defenders slept in shifts, curled up on the mosaic floors, beneath the gaze of the colossal statue of Serapis. The god, made of ivory and gold and studded with emeralds, stared down at them with an expression of benign indifference. He was 18 feet tall, a masterpiece of the sculptor Bryaxis, representing the unity of the underworld and the heavens. But to the men lying at his feet, he was beginning to look like a failure. He had not struck the Christians with lightning. He had not sent a plague. He was just a statue in a dark room. Among the defenders were men whose names we still know: Halladius the priest and Ammonius the grammarian men who would later flee to Constantinople and recount these events to the historian Socrates Scholasticus. They spent the long nights of the siege in agonizing debate. The question was no longer about victory. It was about legacy. They looked at the thousands of scrolls stacked in the Armaria, the plays of Menander, the histories of Manetto, the star charts of Claudius Ptolemy. They knew, with the terrible clarity of the condemned, that they could not save them all. Imagine the conversation in the flickering light of an oil lamp. Should they try to smuggle the most precious texts out through the sewers? Should they bury them in the crypts? Or, in a fit of nihilistic despair, should they burn them? If the world was going to reject the light of reason, perhaps the world deserved the dark. If the Christians believed this knowledge was demonic, why let them inherit it? But they were librarians. To destroy a book was a sin against their very nature. And so, they did nothing. They waited. They hoped that the emperor, far away in the civilized palaces of Constantinople, would intervene. They hoped that Rome still respected its own memory. The waiting ended with the sound of trumpets. A delegation arrived at the base of the hill. It was the Roman prefect of Egypt and the military commander of the province. They carried a scroll sealed with the imperial purple wax. The words spread through the temple like a current of electricity. The rescript has arrived. The verdict of Theodosius. The defenders unbarred the doors. They had to. To refuse an imperial decree was treason, a crime that carried a punishment far worse than death. They stepped out onto the high portico, blinking in the harsh Alexandrian sunlight. Below them, in the great open square, stood a sea of people. On one side, the Christian mob, led by Theophilus, chanting and jeering. On the other, the Roman garrison, standing in silent formation. The prefect unrolled the document. The silence that fell over the square was absolute. He began to read. The emperor's words were couched in the flowery, bureaucratic Latin of the late court, but the meaning was blunt. Theodosius praised the piety of the Christians. He condemned the superstition of the pagans. And then, the sentence. The idols of Alexandria were to be destroyed. The temple of Serapis was to be leveled. A roar went up from the Christian crowd, a sound of triumph and religious ecstasy. The defenders on the steps felt their hearts stop. The temple was doomed. But the prefect raised his hand for silence. There was more. The emperor, in a gesture of calculated clemency, had declared that the men inside the temple were not to be punished. They were granted amnesty. They were free to go, provided they never returned. It was a masterstroke of political maneuvering. Theodosius knew that making martyrs of famous philosophers would only inflame the situation. By sparing the men but killing the god, he stripped the resistance of its dignity. Olympius, the leader of the rebels, understood instantly what had happened. He had prepared to die for his faith, but he was not permitted to be a hero. He was just an evicted tenant. The realization that followed was more painful than the sword. As the defenders looked back into the cool shadows of the library, they realized they were leaving it unprotected. The amnesty applied to them, not to the books. The scrolls were part of the furniture of the idolatrous temple. They were abandoning the collective memory of the human race to a mob that had been told by their emperor that this place was a house of devils. Under the cover of the confusion, while the crowd surged toward the staircase, Olympius and the scholars slipped away. They fled out the back exits, running through the winding alleys of Rhocotis toward the harbor. They would board ships for Italy, for Constantinople, for anywhere that was not here. They left behind their robes, their tools, and their dignity. But most of all, they left behind the books. The night that followed the reading of the decree was the true last night. The defenders were gone. The temple stood open. The mob, held back only by the setting sun, camped at the foot of the steps, sharpening their axes, preparing for the morning's work. Inside the empty hall, the wind blew through the open doors, rustling the edges of the papyrus. The great library was unguarded. It was a carcass waiting for the vultures. The intellect of the ancient world sat alone in the dark, helpless, waiting for the first blow to fall. The morning of the destruction arrived with a bright, relentless sun. Theophilus, the patriarch, did not wait. He marched his followers up the 100 steps of the Acropolis, their sandals slapping against the marble that had been polished by the feet of pilgrims for centuries. The doors of the Serapeum stood open, gaping like a wound. There were no philosophers left to debate, no guards to bar the way. The temple was surrendering. When the mob poured into the central hall, they stopped. They were confronted by the physical presence of the god. The statue of Serapis was so large that its hands touched the walls of the sanctuary. It was a terrifying masterpiece of engineering and art, plated in gold, its eyes made of jeweled stones that seemed to catch the light. A silence fell over the crowd. For generations, they had been told that if a hand was laid upon this image, the earth would crack open and the sky would fall. The power of the old myth was still lodged deep in their reptilian brains. Even Theophilus hesitated. It required a soldier to break the spell. A man stepped forward armed with a double-bladed axe. The historians tell us he climbed a ladder, raised his weapon, and struck the god in the face. The sound of metal on wood and gold echoed through the hall. The cheek of the god shattered. A hush held the room. The sky did not fall. The earth did not shake. Instead, according to the legend recorded by Theodoret, a swarm of mice ran out of the statue's hollow head. The spell was broken. A roar of laughter and rage erupted from the crowd. They surged forward. Ropes were attached to the neck of the god, and he was pulled down, crashing onto the mosaic floor with the weight of a dying age. The body was hacked apart, the limbs dragged through the streets of Alexandria to be burned in the amphitheater. The temple itself was next. Theophilus ordered the demolition of the walls. The gold plating was stripped. The marble was quarried. But amidst the dust and the shouting, a quieter, far more tragic destruction was taking place in the colonnades. The books. The 40,000 scrolls of the daughter library. They were not the primary target of the mob. They were collateral damage. To the zealots, they were merely fuel for the bathhouses, as a later legend would grimly phrase it. They were symbols of a pagan worldview that was being erased. The shelves were tipped over. The armaria were smashed. The scrolls, written by the greatest minds of antiquity, were scattered across the floor. We must visualize the banality of this loss. There was no grand bonfire of wisdom, no solemn ceremony of censorship. It was messy, chaotic, and indifferent. A scroll containing the lost history of the Etruscans might have been used to light a torch. A treatise by Sappho might have been trampled into the mud by 1,000 feet. The intricate star charts of Hipparchus, which mapped the heavens with a precision that would not be matched for 1,000 years, were likely torn apart for the value of the papyrus, or simply left to rot in the open air. When the Christian historian Orosius visited Alexandria 20 years later, he walked through the ruins of the Serapeum. He reported seeing the empty shelves, the armaria standing like open coffins. "There are only empty cases," he wrote, "witnesses to the despoliation. The books were gone. They had not migrated to a new home. They had ceased to exist." The destruction of 391 AD marks the true beginning of the Great Silence. It was the moment when the chain of memory was broken. To understand the scale of the loss, we must look at what we don't have. We have 7 plays by Sophocles. He wrote 120. We have naught but fragments of the epic cycle, the poems that told the rest of the Trojan War story. We have lost the entire works of the atomist Democritus, who theorized the existence of atoms 2 millennia before Einstein. We have lost the engineering manuals that described how the pyramids were built. The dark ages that followed were not dark because the sun went out. They were dark because someone turned off the lights. The literacy rate plummeted. The ability to read the old Greek dialects faded. For centuries, Europe suffered from a collective amnesia. The knowledge that had been concentrated in Alexandria was not rediscovered until the Renaissance, and even then, we were only recovering the scraps that had been saved by Arab scholars or hidden in Byzantine monasteries. We are still, in many ways, living in the ruins of that library, trying to piece together the mosaic from a handful of surviving tiles. But the story of the Library of Alexandria is not just a tragedy, it is a ghost story. The physical library was destroyed, but the idea of the library proved to be fireproof. The memory of a place where all knowledge was gathered became a kind of Camelot for the intellect, a myth that haunted the imagination of the world. It inspired the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. It inspired the great university libraries of Oxford and Bologna. It inspired the Library of Congress. In 2002, the ghost returned to the coast of Egypt. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina was inaugurated near the site of the original harbor. It is a massive, disc-shaped building, tilted toward the sea like a rising sun. Its walls are carved with letters from every alphabet in human history. It is a resurrection. But if you walk through its gleaming modern halls, you will feel a pang of melancholy. You realize that no matter how many servers we fill with data, no matter how many books we print, we can never truly replace what was lost on that sunny afternoon in the 4th century. The last night of the Library of Alexandria teaches us a terrifying lesson. Knowledge is not cumulative. It is fragile. It is reversible. Civilization is a thin layer of ice resting on a deep ocean of chaos, and it does not take much, a fire, a mob, a decree, to break the surface and send the works of 1,000 years sinking into the dark. As we stand today in the digital age, building our own universal library in the cloud, we would do well to remember the Serapeum. We are not immune. The servers can be wiped. The formats can become obsolete. The power can go out. And somewhere, in the shadows of history, the mob is always waiting at the bottom of the steps.